Caldoran stood before the Zorgan High Council, his head held high despite the shackles binding his wrists. The chamber was cavernous, with towering obsidian walls that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The Zorgans themselves were an imposing sight, tall, reptilian beings with scales that shimmered like oil slicks and eyes that glowed a piercing amber. Caldoran of Earth, the High Chancellor hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. You stand accused of defiance against the Zorgan Empire, of spreading dissent and rebellion among the subjugated races. How do you plead? Cal met the Chancellor's gaze unflinchingly. I plead guilty to standing up for what's right, he said, his voice ringing clear in the chamber. Guilty of believing that all sentient beings deserve freedom and self-determination, not to live under the boot of Zorgan oppression. A murmur rippled through the assembled Zorgans, a mix of outrage and grudging respect. Cal had been a thorn in their side for years, a human diplomat who had repeatedly called out their cruel practices and worked tirelessly to unite the disparate races chafing under Zorgan rule. The Chancellor slammed his clawed fist down on the podium, silencing the murmurs. You test our patience, human, he growled. Your words are poison, your actions a threat to the stability of our empire. You leave us no choice. He gestured to a hulking Zorgan guard. Bring forth the orb of judgment. The guard approached, holding aloft a pulsing sphere of dark crystal. Cal felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what the orb was, had heard the whispered stories of its power. The Chancellor took the orb, holding it aloft. Caldoran, for your crimes against the Zorgan Empire, we sentence you to exile on the death world of Tarthos. May the beasts feast on your flesh and your bones bleach under its merciless suns. Cal's heart hammered in his chest, but he refused to show fear. Sarthos. The name was spoken only in terrified whispers, a planet so hostile, so teeming with vicious predators, that even the Zorgans shunned it. To be sent there was a death sentence, a cruel and vicious punishment reserved for only the most hated enemies of the Empire. The Chancellor began to chant in the guttural language of the Zorgans, the orb glowing brighter with each word. Cal felt a strange tingling sensation wash over him, a pull like gravity suddenly shifty. The chamber around him seemed to blur and elongate, the faces of the Zorgans stretching into nightmarish distortions. Then, with a blinding flash and a sickening lurch, Cal felt himself ripped from the chamber, hurtling through a maelstrom of light and shadow. His last thought, before the darkness claimed him, was a defiant one. The Zorgans thought this was the end for him. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. Cal awoke to the sensation of searing heat and the stench of sulfur. He was lying on his back, staring up at a sky the color of bruised flesh, with two bloated suns glowering down at him. Every inch of his body ached, and his envirosuit was torn, the protective fabric hanging off him in shreds. He sat up gingerly, his head spinning, and surveyed his surroundings. He was in a vast, rocky wasteland, the ground beneath him a jagged obsidian that seemed to drink in the harsh light of the suns. In the distance, he could see towering rock formations, their surfaces pockmarked with caves that seemed to promise shelter from the unrelenting heat. But it was what he saw on the horizon that made his blood run cold. Massive, lumbering shapes, moving with a predatory grace that belied their size. Sarthos' infamous beasts, the apex predators that ruled this hellish landscape. Even from here, Cal could feel the malevolence radiating off them, the hunger in their movements. He struggled to his feet, every joint screaming in protest. His survival kit, meager as it was, had made the journey with him, still clipped to his belt. A canteen of water, a few nutrient bars, a small medkit, and a long, wickedly sharp dagger, barely enough to keep him alive for a few days on a normal planet. Here, on Sarthos, it was almost laughable. But Cal had never been one to give up easily. He had faced down the Zorgan Empire, had stood tall in the face of their cruelty and oppression. He would not let this planet, as vicious and unforgiving as it was, be the end of him. With grim determination, he set off toward the distant rock formations, the suns beating down on him mercilessly. Each step was an agony, the heat sapping his strength, but he pushed on. He had to find shelter, had to find a way to survive. And Cal vowed he had to find a way to make the Zorgans regret the day they had ever crossed him. This planet, hellish as it was, would not be his grave. It would be the crucible in which he would be reforged, transformed into something the Zorgans would learn to fear. The suns continued their relentless arc across the sky as Cal walked, the landscape around him shimmering with heat. But with each step, a new resolve hardened in his heart. He would survive this. And then, Zorgan Empire be damned, he would make them pay. The days on Xarthos bled into one another, each one a relentless battle for survival under the planet's merciless suns. Cal quickly learned that the searing heat of midday was almost impossible to endure, forcing him to seek shelter in the dank network of caves that honeycombed the towering rock formations. But the nights were almost worse. As the suns dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, turning the scorching landscape into a frigid wasteland. The dark brought out Xarthos' nocturnal predators, their eerie cries echoing across the barren plains. Cal had managed to scavenge enough materials from his wrecked escape pod to fashion a makeshift shelter within one of the caves. It was a meager thing, little more than a lean-to of jagged metal and frayed wiring, but it provided some protection from the elements and the prowling beasts. Food and water were a constant struggle. The nutrient bars from his survival kit had run out within the first week, and the water from his canteen barely lasted longer. He had managed to find a few sparse, spiky plants that contained a bitter but life-sustaining sap, and had even managed to catch a few of the small lizard-like creatures that scurried among the rocks. But it was never enough, his stomach constantly gnawing with hunger. But Cal's most pressing concern was the beasts. He had encountered them more times than he cared to count, their massive forms looming out of the shimmering heat or the inky darkness. He had managed to evade them so far, using his wits and his agility to outsmart their brute strength. But each encounter left him shaken, painfully aware of how outmatched he was. It was during one such encounter that everything changed. Cal was foraging at the edge of the wasteland, his dagger at the ready, when he heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the usual lumbering monstrosities. But the creature that emerged from the shimmering haze was unlike anything Cal had ever seen. It was enormous, easily twice the size of the other beasts, with a hide that gleamed like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed a fierce, intelligent orange. But what caught Cal's attention were the creature's forearms. They were longer and more muscular than those of the other beasts, tipped with wickedly curved claws that looked capable of shredding steel. A ravager. Cal had heard stories of these legendary beasts, whispered tales of their ferocity and cunning. They were said to be the apex predators of Tarthos, the undisputed kings of this hellish world. And one was staring right at him. Cal's hand tightened on his dagger, his heart pounding. He knew he stood no chance against a creature like this. But to his surprise, the ravager didn't attack. It just stood there, its orange eyes fixed on Cal with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Slowly, cautiously, Cal took a step back. The ravager matched his movement, taking a step forward. But there was no aggression in its posture, no hint of attack. If anything, it seemed curious. As the tense standoff continued, Cal began to notice something else. The ravager was injured. A deep, jagged gash ran down its flank, oozing a dark, viscous blood. It was a wound that would have been a death sentence for any lesser creature. Suddenly, Cal understood. The ravager was an apex predator, yes, but it was not invincible. And right now, weakened and wounded, it saw in Cal not prey, but a potential ally. It was a risky gamble, Cal knew. The ravager could turn on him at any moment. But the longer he stared into those fiercely intelligent eyes, the more he felt a strange kinship with the beast. They were both survivors, both fighters against the odds. Slowly, Cal lowered his dagger. The ravager watched him intently, its muscular form tense and coiled. Cal reached into his pouch and pulled out one of his few remaining nutrient bars. With a careful, deliberate motion, he tossed it to the ground at the Ravager's feet. The beast sniffed at the bar suspiciously, then, with a lightning-quick motion, snatched it up and devoured it. Its eyes never left Cal's. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. A bridge tentatively built between human and beast. Cal didn't know where this unexpected alliance would lead, but one thing was certain. His odds of survival had just increased dramatically. In the grand halls of the Zorgan Citadel, High Chancellor Exarchov stood before a vast holographic display, his reptilian eyes narrowed in contemplation. The display showed a star map of the Empire, each conquered world marked in the bloody red of Zorgan control. It was an impressive sight, a testament to the might and reach of the Zorgan war machine. But Exarchov's satisfaction was marred by a niggling thought, a loose end that had been bothering him for weeks. Cal Doran, the human rebel, the thorn in the Empire's side. Kharkov had thought him dealt with, exiled to die on the savage world of Tarthos. But now, an unsettling report from a scout drone had cast doubt on that assumption. The drone, sent to Xarthos to survey the planet for potential resources, had detected an anomaly, a life sign, faint but unmistakable, in a region of the planet known to be particularly inhospitable. It was impossible, Xarkov had thought at first. No human could survive on Xarthos for this long. The planet's vicious predators should have torn Doran apart within days. But the more he considered it, the more uneasy Exarchov became. Cal Doran had proven himself resourceful and resilient, a constant annoyance to the Empire's plans. If anyone could find a way to survive on Xarthos, it would be him. Exarchov's clawed hand clenched into a fist. He could not allow this uncertainty to continue. If Doran was alive, he needed to know. And if he was, the human needed to be dealt with permanently this time. He turned to his aide, a spindly Zorgan with a face like a pinched skull. "Prepare a scout ship," he ordered, his voice a guttural rasp. "Assemble a team of our best warriors. We're going to Xarthos." The aide bowed, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. "As you command, High Chancellor." As the aide scurried off to make preparations, Exarchov turned back to the star map, his gaze fixed on the small, blinking light that represented Xarthos. Cal Doran, he thought, a grim anticipation building in his chest. If you are alive, you will soon wish you weren't. The journey to Xarthos was tense and silent, the Zorgan scout ship cutting through the void like a jagged blade. Exarchov sat in the command chair, his clawed fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the armrest. He was flanked by a dozen of the Empire's most deadly warriors, each one a towering mass of reptilian muscle and gleaming battle armor. As the ship entered Xarthos' atmosphere, the view outside the ports was engulfed in flames, the hull shuddering under the strain of entry. But Exarchov barely noticed, his focus entirely on the hunt to come. The ship touched down in a blasted expanse of obsidian rock, the impact sending shockwaves through the hull. Exarchov was on his feet immediately, his warriors falling into step behind him as he strode down the ramp and onto the surface of Tarthos. The heat was like a physical blow, the radiation from the planet's twin suns slamming into them with almost tangible force. But the Zorgans, evolved from a reptilian species, barely felt it. Their scales shimmered in the harsh light as they scanned the horizon, their weapons at the ready. The scout drone's data led them to a series of jagged rock formations, towering spires that clawed at the bruised sky. As they approached, Xarchov's keen senses picked up signs of life. The faint scent of sweat, the scrape of footsteps on stone. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a predatory grin. Cal Doran was here. He could feel it. They found him at the base of the largest spire, a lone figure in a tattered envirosuit. He was standing with his back to them, seemingly unaware of their presence. Exarchov felt a surge of vicious satisfaction. This was almost too easy. But as they drew closer, Sarkov started to notice something strange. Doran's posture was not one of a broken man, beaten down by the harsh realities of Tarthos. He stood tall and confident, his shoulders squared. And there, at his feet, Sarkov's eyes widened. Bones, the massive, bleached bones of Sarthos' notorious predators. The sight checked him, a flicker of unease passing through him. Then Doran turned, and Sarkov saw his face. The human's eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding light. His features hardened into a mask of determination. And beside him, rising from the shadows of the rocks, Sarkov heard the gasps of his warriors, felt his own breath catch in his throat. It was a ravager, a beast out of legend, its massive form rippling with muscle, its obsidian hide gleaming in the harsh sunlight. And it was standing at Doran's side, not as a beast of prey, but as an ally. Sarkov's mind reeled. This was impossible. No human could tame a ravager, could survive alone on Sarthos for so long. Yet here Doran stood, living proof of the impossible. Doran stepped forward, his hand resting on the ravager's flank. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but it carried an undeniable strength. Chancellor Sarkov, I wish I could say it was a pleasure. Sarkov found his voice, forcing past the shock. Doran, you continue to surprise. Doran smiled, a flash of teeth in his sun-weathered face. You made a mistake, Chancellor. Sending me here, throwing me away like garbage. It made me stronger. It showed me what I'm capable of. Sarkov hissed, his hand dropping to the blaster at his hip. A mistake I intend to rectify. But Doran was shaking his head. I don't think so. You see, I've learned a lot here on Sarthos. About survival, about strength, and about the bonds between living things, even in the harshest of circumstances. He patted the ravager, and the beast rumbled, a deep sound that Sarkov felt in his bones. You can't win here, Sarkov. This is my domain now. Sarthos has made me more than you could ever imagine. For a long moment, Sarkov was silent, his reptilian eyes locked with Doran's human ones. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand from his blaster. This isn't over, Doran. The Zorgan Empire does not forget, and it does not forgive. Doran's smile widened. I'm counting on it, Chancellor. I'm counting on it. With a snarled command, Sarkov turned, his warriors falling into step behind him. They marched back to their ship, leaving Doran and his monstrous companion standing amidst the bones of Sarthos' fallen beasts. As the ship blasted off, leaving the hellish landscape of Sarthos behind, Sarkov sat in silent rage. Doran had bested him, had proven himself stronger than the will of the Zorgan Empire. It was unthinkable. But as the stars streaked past the viewport, a cold, calculating part of Sarkov's mind was already turning, already planning. Doran might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. On the surface of Sarthos, Doran watched the Zorgan ship disappear into the sky, a trail of fire in its wake. He felt the ravager shift beside him, a living mountain of muscle and claws. They had won today. Against all odds they had survived, had proven themselves stronger than the machinations of the Zorgan Empire. But knew this was only the beginning. The Zorgans would be back, and next time, they would not underestimate him. Next time, they would come with all the might and fury of the Empire. But as stood there, the heat of Sarthos' suns on his face, the presence of the ravager at his side, he felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Let them come, he thought. Let them bring their worst. He had survived Sarthos. He had tamed a ravager. There was nothing the Zorgan Empire could throw at him that he couldn't handle. This was his fight now, his war. And he would not rest until the Zorgan Empire was brought to its knees, until every subjugated race was free from their tyrannical rule. Doran, the exile of Earth, the survivor of Tarthos, had found his purpose, and the galaxy would tremble before him. The interior of the Zorgan ship was a claustrophobic labyrinth of dark, pulsing corridors, the walls seeming to throb with the beat of some monstrous heart. Cal Doran stood in the center of what passed for the ship's bridge, the Ravager a looming presence at his side. Around them, the Zorgan warriors stood in a tense semicircle, their clawed hands never far from their weapons. Zarkov faced Cal, his reptilian features set in a mask of barely contained rage. "You test our patience, human," he hissed, his forked tongue flickering. "This beast of yours, it is dangerous, unpredictable." Cal met the Chancellor's gaze unflinchingly. "So am I," he said, his voice quiet but filled with steel. "You'd do well to remember that." A low growl rumbled from the Ravager's throat, a sound that made the Zorgan warriors shift uneasily. Cal laid a calming hand on the beast's flank, marveling at the strength he could feel beneath its obsidian hide. Zarkov's eyes narrowed. "We are returning to Zorgan Prime. The High Council will want to see this development for themselves. They will decide your fate and that of your pet." Cal's jaw tightened at the word pet, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew he was walking a razor's edge here. The Zorgans needed him alive, at least for now. They wouldn't dare kill him outright, not when he had proven himself capable of surviving the worst they could throw at him. But an accident on the journey back, that was a very real possibility. And then there was the Ravager. Cal had no illusions about what the Zorgans wanted with the beast. To them, it was a specimen, a creature to be dissected and studied. They wanted to unravel the secrets of its strength, to use that knowledge to create even more formidable weapons of war. Cal couldn't let that happen. The Ravager was more than just a beast to him now. It was a comrade, a friend forged in the crucible of Sartho's unforgiving wilds. He had to protect it, just as it had protected him. The journey back to Zorgan Prime was a tense one. Cal and the Ravager were confined to a small, heavily guarded chamber deep within the ship. Cal paced the room like a caged animal, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. The Ravager, in contrast, seemed almost serene, lounging on the metal floor like a great obsidian cat. But Cal could see the watchfulness in the beast's eyes, the coiled readiness in its muscles. It knew, just as he did, that they were in the heart of enemy territory now. As the ship hurtled through the void, Cal's thoughts turned to the future. What would happen when they reached Zorgan Prime? Would he be able to convince the High Council of his worth, of his potential as an ally against the threats that lurked in the galaxy's shadows? And what of the Ravager? Cal knew he could never let the Zorgans have the beast, never let them turn it into a lab specimen or a weapon of war. But how could he protect it, here in the very heart of the Empire's power? These thoughts chased each other around Cal's mind as the ship sped onwards, carrying him and his unlikely companion towards an uncertain fate. But one thing was certain in Cal's heart. Whatever happened, whatever trials lay ahead, he would not abandon the Ravager. They had forged a bond on Sarthos, a connection deeper than mere words could express. Together, they had survived the impossible. Together, they would face whatever the Zorgan Empire had in store. And together, perhaps, they could change the face of the galaxy itself. The Zorgan ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, the stomach-churning sensation of deceleration, jolting Cal from his uneasy sleep. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding, his every sense on high alert. Beside him, the Ravager stirred, its orange eyes glowing in the dim light of their shared cell. It could sense the change, too, the tension that hung heavy in the recycled air. They had arrived at Zorgan Prime. Cal had barely a moment to collect his thoughts before the cell door slid open with a hiss. Harkoth stood in the doorway, flanked by a phalanx of heavily armed guards. The Chancellor's reptilian face was set in a mask of grim determination. "It is time, human," he rasped, his clawed hand resting on the blaster at his hip. "The High Council awaits." Cal stepped forward, the Ravager moving to follow, but Sarkoth held up a clawed hand. "The beast stays here," he hissed. "It is too dangerous to be allowed before the council." Cal's jaw clenched, a hot surge of anger rising in his chest. But he knew he had to play this carefully. He couldn't afford to show his hand. Not yet. With a calming gesture to the Ravager, he stepped out of the cell, allowing the guards to surround him. As they marched through the ship's pulsing corridors, Cal's mind raced, desperately seeking the way out of this predicament. He knew he couldn't let the Zorgans separate him from the Ravager. Together, they stood a chance. Alone, he feared what the Empire might do. As they reached the ship's main airlock, Zarkov turned to him, his eyes glinting with malicious anticipation. "The High Council has great plans for you, Caldoran," he hissed. "And for your beast. Great plans indeed." Cal met the Chancellor's gaze, a cold, hard determination settling over him. "Plans have a way of going already," he said softly. "Especially where I'm concerned." And with that he acted. In a blur of motion, he lashed out, his fist connecting with the nearest guard's throat. As the Zorgan staggered, choking, Cal snatched his blaster, turning it on the others with lightning speed. Chaos erupted. Blaster fire filled the corridor, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burning flesh. Cal was a whirlwind of motion, diving and rolling, his stolen blaster spitting death with every shot. But there were too many of them. For every Zorgan that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Cal felt a searing pain as a blaster bolt grazed his shoulder, the smell of his own charred flesh filling his nostrils. He fell back, his back slamming against the airlock door. Zarkov advanced on him, his own blaster leveled at Cal's chest. "Foolish human," the Chancellor snarled. "Did you really think you could best us? Here, at the very heart of our power." Cal's lips curled into a blood-flecked grin. "I wasn't trying to best you," he panted. "I was just buying time." Zarkov's eyes widened. Behind him, a deep, reverberating growl filled the corridor. The Chancellor spun, just in time to see a massive obsidian form burst from the depths of the ship. The Ravager had come. What followed was a maelstrom of claws and teeth and blaster fire. The Ravager was a force of nature, unstoppable in its fury. It tore through the Zorgan, ranks like a hot knife through butter, its claws rending armor and flesh alike. Cal was right beside it, his blaster flashing, his battle cry ringing through the ship. Together, they fought, human and beast, a bond forged in blood and fire. And against all odds, they were winning. Zarkov's face was a mask of disbelieving horror as he watched his warriors fall. He turned to flee, but Cal was there, his blaster leveled at the Chancellor's head. "Going somewhere?" Cal asked, his voice hard. Zarkov's eyes darted left and right, seeking escape, but there was none to be found. The corridor was a charnel house, the floor slick with Zorgan blood. "This isn't over," the Chancellor hissed, his voice trembling. "The Empire will hunt you. To the ends of the galaxy, they will hunt you." Cal smiled, a hard, bitter smile. "Let them come," he said. "We'll be waiting." And with that he fired. Zarkov crumpled, his reptilian, eyes going wide and glassy. Cal stood over the fallen Chancellor for a long moment, his chest heaving, his blaster smoking in his hand. Then he turned, his gaze seeking out the Ravager. The beast was wounded, green blood oozing from a dozen cuts and burns, but it was alive, its orange eyes bright with fierce, savage pride. Cal limped to the beast's side, laying a hand on its massive flank. "Let's get out of here," he said softly, "before the whole damned Empire comes down on our heads." The Ravager rumbled its agreement, and together they turned towards the airlock. Towards freedom. They took a Zorgan shuttle, Cal's fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls as he coaxed the small craft out of the docking bay. As they blasted away from the Zorgan ship, Cal felt a giddy rush of elation. They had done it. Against all odds, they had escaped the very heart of the Zorgan Empire. But even as the thought crossed his mind, the shuttle's sensors screamed a warning. Cal's heart sank as he saw the readings. A dozen Zorgon warships, dropping out of hyperspace all around them. They had escaped the nest, but now the hornets were swarming. Cal's hands flew over the controls, pushing the shuttle's engines to their limits. The small craft darted and weaved, desperately trying to evade the onslaught of blaster fire that filled the void. But it was only a matter of time. The shuttle shuddered as a blast caught its rear shields, alarms blaring, lights flickering. Cal gritted his teeth, fighting to keep the craft under control. Beside him, the Ravager growled, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to fill the tiny cockpit. Cal glanced at the beast, seeing the determination in its fiery eyes. "Looks like this might be it, big guy," Cal said, his voice rough. "It's been one hell of a ride." The Ravager rumbled, the sound almost a purr. It understood, Cal realized. It knew the odds they faced, the inevitability of their fate. But it was content. They had fought side by side, had forged a bond unbreakable. If this was to be their end, they would meet it together. Cal turned back to the controls, a strange calm settling over him. He thought of Earth, of the green hills and blue skies he had left behind so long ago. He thought of his comrades in the Resistance, still fighting, still hoping. He thought of the Ravager, of the impossible bond they had forged on the bloody sands of Sarthos. "Let's give 'em hell," Cal whispered. And with a defiant roar, he hurled the shuttle straight at the heart of the Zorgon formation, blasters blazing, engines screaming the war cry to the uncaring stars. It was a blaze of glory, a final defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the shuttle exploded, as the void lit up with the fire of their passing, Caldoran knew that their story, the story of the human and the beast, would live on. A legend whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy, a tale of hope, of courage, of the unbreakable strength of the spirit. They had made their mark, and the galaxy would never be the same. In the cycles that followed, the story of Caldoran and the Ravagers spread like wildfire across the subjugated worlds of the Zorgon Empire. It was whispered in the slave pits of Halvar Prime, murmured in the dark alleys of Kellanok, shouted from the rooftops of a dozen rebellious planets. The human who had tamed the beast of Sarthos, the warrior who had brought the fight to the very heart of Zorgon power, the legend who had given his life for a chance at freedom. Caldoran was dead, but his spirit, his indomitable will, lived on. In the hearts of the downtrodden and the oppressed, his name became a rallying cry, a symbol of hope in the face of tyranny. And on Sarthos, the savage world that had forged the legend, a new story began to take shape. The Ravagers, the great obsidian beasts that had once been the bane of all life, began to change, began to evolve. It started with small things, a reluctance to attack, a glimmer of something like understanding in their fiery eyes. But as the cycles turned, the changes became more pronounced. The Ravagers began to communicate, not just with each other, but with the other creatures of Sarthos. They developed a rudimentary language, a complex system of growls and rumbles and body postures. And they remembered. They remembered the human, the soft, fragile creature that had fought beside them, had earned their respect and their loyalty. They remembered Caldoran. In the deep caves of Sarthos, the Ravagers gathered. They shared their stories, passed down the tale of the human and the beast, the bond forged in blood and fire. And they made a decision. No longer would they be the monsters of Sarthos. No longer would they hunt and kill without reason or mercy. They would become something more, something greater. They would become the guardians of their world, the protectors of all life. They would stand against the darkness, against the tyranny of the Zorgon Empire. Just as Caldoran had stood, the galaxy shifted. The balance of power, once so certain, began to waver. On a dozen worlds, the seeds of rebellion took root, nourished by the legend of a man and a beast. The Zorgon Empire, vast and powerful though it was, began to feel the first tremors of fear. For in the hearts of the oppressed, a new fire had been lit, a fire of hope, of defiance. a fire that would not be quenched. And at the edge of known space, on a world once thought lost to savagery, a new power was rising. The Ravagers of Arthos, once the stuff of nightmares, now stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even against the most impossible odds, the spirit could endure, could overcome, could be free. The legend of Cal Doran lived on, not just in the tales whispered in the shadows, but in the very fabric of the galaxy itself, in the courage of the downtrodden, in the fire of the rebel heart. In the gleaming eyes of the Ravagers, the beasts who had learned the true meaning of strength from a man who had been more than a master, who had been a friend, the galaxy would never forget. And in the end, that was Cal Doran's greatest legacy. Not the battles he had fought, not the enemies he had bested, but the hope he had kindled, the fire he had lit, a fire that would burn, bright and fierce and eternal, long after the stars themselves had gone dark. For such is the strength of the human spirit, such is the power of a legend. The end.